Hello, Michelle here from Crafty Flutterby Creations. Today I'm going to show you how to add beads to knitting or crochet as you go with this handy tool that I make. The tool and a pack of 6-0 beads, which are perfect for fingering lace and sport weight yarns, are available on my website, linked below in the profile. The tool is pretty handy because you can load up beads on it, and even when you turn it upside down, they don't fall off. So if you're a little clumsy, or if you have a lot of kids or pets hanging around that might knock a container of beads over, it's a very handy way to add beads as you go. Or if you travel, then you don't have to worry about it. To put beads on the tool, you simply push them on the folded end, and they slide down. And that's all there is to that. It's nice to add beads to knitting and crochet because they add sparkle and they add drape, which means that things hang better. If you have a very lightweight shawl, having a beaded edging will mean that it's less likely to blow away in the wind. And later in this video, I'll show you the beaded picot bind off. So let's start with knitting. I like to put beads on the stitch above a yarn over. And here's what it looks like on knit. And when you add them as you go, as you can see, they're visible on both the right and the wrong side of the project. For this stitch pattern for the sample, I'm using a very basic stitch of knit 1, yarn over, knit 2 together. I always put a 3-stitch garter edge just to help it lay flat. So that's another tip. Garter, few stitches of garter on the edge help it to lay flat. Alright, and on this stitch pattern, I'm adding the beads above the knit 2 together. In all of the patterns I've written with beads, you work the stitch and then add the bead. And it's quite often the purl stitch above the yarn over. So there's 3 basic steps that apply to both knitting and crochet. First, you use the tool to lift the stitch off the needle. You put the hook in the loop and pull it off the needle. Then you pinch it together and slip the bead onto the stitch. That's step 2, is putting the bead on the stitch. And then you put the stitch back on the needle. Simple as that. So now I need to knit 1, yarn over, knit 2 together, and I can show that to you again. So we lift the stitch off the needle, pull the bead onto it, and place it back on the needle with the stitch underneath. I'm using the hook, and it grabs the whole strand of the yarn quite nicely so that it doesn't split the ply of the yarn. Pinch it together, slip a bead on, pull it down, and put it back on the needle with the bead underneath. And then cinch the yarn up tight so the loop's on the needle. And it doesn't matter which direction you put it, whether it's twisted the correct way or not, because the bead covers up that part of the stitch, so it doesn't matter. And with crochet, it's the same thing, only we lift it off the hook instead of off the needle. So we slip the hook into the loop on the hook, pull it off, pinch it closed, slide a bead down, make sure it goes over both strands of the tool, push it onto the stitch, and put it back on the hook, or put the hook back through. And then keep crocheting. And the same principle applies to crocheted projects as with knitting. When you add beads, it adds sparkle and drape. And this is just a row of single crochet. It's nothing fancy, but anywhere you have a loop. Actually, with crochet it can be easier to just pull the hook out, grab the beading tool, into the loop, slip a bead on, push it down the hoop, let the beading tool go, and then put the hook back in. With crochet, it's not really necessary to use it to pull it off the hook, but you can if you wish. And then when you do the next crochet stitch, that's what secures the bead in place. And again, just like with knitting, when you add the beads as you go, they're visible on both sides. Now, for the beaded picot bind-off. I love picot bind-offs, and I especially love beaded picot bind-offs because they add a bit of sparkle to the tip, and they add a nice weight to the yarn, to the project, I should say. Alright, so for a picot bind-off, what we have to do is cast on 2 stitches. Because we add extra stitches before we bind them off. There's 1, 2. And that's what creates the picots. And then we use the tool to put a picot on the last cast on stitch for the picot bind-off, because different picot bind-offs may have different numbers of cast on stitches depending upon how long the picot will be. So I lift it off the needle, slide a bead on, and right there, see, I didn't quite catch both loops, so that's not going to work. I need to pinch them together a little tighter and push it on again, and now both loops are there. Slide it down, put it back on the needle with the bead underneath, and then for this stitch pattern, the instructions are to bind off 4. I'll do a knitted bind off for this. Which is I knit 1, 2, and then slip this one over that one. So I need to bind off 3 times. So that was 1 bound off, 2 bound off, 3 bound off, and 4 bound off. And that completes 1 beaded picot. So then to do the next one, I have to slip this stitch from the right needle back onto the left needle to be able to cast on 2 more stitches knitwise. And then we just repeat from there. So I've cast on 1, 2. Now I'm ready to add a bead to this. And that creates this beautiful beaded picot bind-off, which I've used on Apparent Glitz and on this upcoming pattern called In the Sky, which has a pretty lace butterfly stitch pattern on it. So for more beading tips and for a photo tutorial of this technique, check out my blog post linked below. The beading tool in this video is also available in the blog post linked below. Thank you for watching. Happy crafting!